Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at political news and events through a generational lens. I'm Professor James Davenport. This is my marvelous colleague, Dr. Emily Stacy, and we are going to be talking about what everybody's talking about today, which is the recent Supreme Court oral arguments over abortion, right? And this is the, is it Dobbs versus Jackson Health Organization, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And so in this case specifically, the court was asked by one of the parties to overturn its rulings in both Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And so this is obviously, abortion is one of the most controversial issues in American politics today. It has been for quite some time. The court has seen cases before on this issue. Never has it, to my knowledge, has it been asked to directly overturn those two cases at the Supreme Court level. But that was the request by as I mentioned, one of the parties, the state of Mississippi, that requested that in their presentation before the court yesterday. I'll hand it over to you. What would you like to?
Wow.
Where would you like to go with this? I gave him the rundown.
That was a smooth transition, sir. Smooth operator
I'm
there.
telling you.
So, I mean, yeah, you summarized it perfectly. I think a very clinical summarization, because obviously, as you noted, it is an extremely hot topic, very controversial. Obviously, folks have very deep-rooted feelings, beliefs, sometimes religious, sometimes more intimate and personal, first-hand lived experiences. And so this makes it a very volatile issue in American politics. The statistics, right? So just off the top of my head, and it may have changed, but in 2019, the statistic was 1 in 3 millennial women will have had an abortion in her lifetime. And that statistic is pretty stark. And so that means that a lot of women that you are seeing that are ages, 22 to 40, right? A third of them have had an experience with an abortion clinic or provider, or walking up to the building to actually complete the procedure, etc. And so again, it is just a very intimate issue to a lot of folks. So the arguments yesterday. I think that, number one, and I think that you will appreciate this, the first thing that I noticed and that I was really disappointed in was the lack of Justice Roberts, Chief Justice John Roberts. He has been, and as we've talked about before regarding other Supreme Court decisions and hearings, etc., Roberts has been a very strict constructivist. He's been a very strict upholder of precedent. And I did not hear enough of that from him yesterday. Really, we didn't hear much at all from him yesterday. In fact, we got one of our first, kind of like a Bigfoot sighting. Clarence Thomas actually spoke yesterday, right? Which was
is unusual. He normally does not.
Very unusual. Yeah. But it seemed very clear. Listening. I didn't listen to it. I got it all through Twitter. Thank God. Thank God for Twitter live tweeting and all of that good stuff. So I got the transcripts of what was going on and the gist from different pundits and folks, reporters that were working the scene. It seemed pretty clear that there's certainly 5 out of the 4 that are at least willing to, if not overturn Roe versus Wade, certainly limit the viability, right? And I think that's the key word here.
Right. So one of the things that, and I think it's helpful to go back to the court's opinion in both Roe v. Wade versus Planned Parenthood. There's a lot on both sides of this issue. There's a lot of misinterpretation of both of those opinions. The court never, in Roe v. Wade or any subsequent opinion, never stated that there was an absolute unrestricted right to obtain an abortion. The court in Roe v. Wade said they set up this kind of trimester regime, right? They did mention viability, but they kind of set up this trimester regime. And they basically said, early on in the pregnancy, the state's interest in protecting the life of the unborn child is not great. As the pregnancy moves on and develops, the state's interest in protecting that life increases, right? In Casey, the court comes in and kind of does away with that trimester regime and instead says that we're going to focus solely on that point of viability.
Right.
And by viability we mean at the point at which that unborn child could actually live outside the womb. Right?
Personhood, right? There was a personhood movement going on.
And so this has been kind of the dividing line, and the court has acknowledged that in Casey they also said that while states can regulate abortion, states cannot place what they called an undue burden upon women obtaining an abortion pre-viability.
Right.
And so we've got people on both sides saying that the court has said, well, you can do it anytime you want, anywhere they want. No, they didn't. Or that any court acknowledgement that a restriction could be placed by those on the other side say that, oh, not following Roe v. Wade. So lots of, and it's all wrapped up into kind of this emotional, as you said, heated argumentation.
Yes.
But the court has said there is a point in time at which the state does have a right to say we're going to look at that unborn child as a human being, as an individual person, but it's not in the early stages of the pregnancy. And there have been a lot of attempts in a lot of places to try to minimize that court ruling and to try to place additional restrictions. Some restrictions the court, as I said, has allowed, some it has not. Yesterday, the court was asked to do away with the viability standard, and there was an exchange between, I think it may have been between Thomas and the Attorney General for Mississippi, may have been one of the others, in which they said if you don't
Thomas.
completely overrule the Roe v. Wade, we at least want you to do away with the viability standard and go to kind of a rational basis or type argument.
The process.
Yes. And so obviously people who are concerned about access to reproductive health and rights of personal autonomy are very concerned that this is going to restrict that. I did not find the Attorney General's arguments overly persuasive about there not being anything in the Constitution that supported Roe v. Wade. I mean, they clearly, there's no specific right expressed in the Constitution for this. But by the way, there's also no specific right for you to live wherever you want to live, or to work for whoever you want to work.
To not own slaves, or to marry whom you want.
In some of these cases, to marry whoever you want to marry.
Interracial, which is why it was hysterical that it was Clarence Thomas that brought it up, because he's in an interracial marriage, and it would have perhaps done away with those laws.
So what the court has to do is to say, okay, what does the tenor of the Constitution say on these matters? And in Roe v. Wade, they pulled pieces of the Constitution, 14th Amendment, 9th Amendment, which we've talked about before, the 4th Amendment, those three specifically that I remember, pulled together and said, you add these up and you have a personal zone of privacy / autonomy that the state is not permitted to interfere with. And what the Attorney General of Mississippi said is, in the case of abortion, and understand, this won't be just restricted to abortion.
No,
I mean, that's not how this stuff works.
Nope.
In the case of abortion, though, we want you to undo that. And the court does seem that, I think you're right, there do seem to be 5 votes, at least coming from oral arguments. It seemed to be there are probably 5 votes to do that. What that will mean, it will mean this will be pushed back to the states, and you're going to have states like Oklahoma and Texas and others. There will become much more restrictive on the ability of women to obtain any kind of abortion. You'll have other states like California and New York who will probably be even more lenient with their regimes, if they can be. And then it's going to be interesting to see how anti-abortion states treat people in their state who want to go to another state to obtain an abortion,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's going to be an issue.
I
If you
agree.
don't think it is,
Yeah.
you're wrong-headed about this.
Yeah,
In fact,
I agree.
if by some strange occurrence those 5 votes don't materialize, I think you could see states like Oklahoma trying to prevent people leaving Texas coming up here to
Yep.
obtain an abortion.
Oh, for sure.
I think you're going to see some
Yeah.
stuff happen there as well.
Yeah, I think so. Before we leave the Supreme Court, because I do want to talk about abortion pills, because this doesn't touch any sort of legislation on abortion pills. Obviously, I think, again, as you reiterated, the 5-4 vote is the writing is seemingly on the wall, and I think that is why you saw Justice Sotomayor propose or not propose, but offer up the questions that she did, and really talking about the viability and the legitimacy of the Supreme Court in the future. I'm not sure if our very educated audience has seen the ABC poll that came out most recently, where about 60% of your country believes that the Supreme Court should not overturn Roe versus Wade. Again, the viability of the Supreme Court, legitimacy of the Supreme Court is really at stake here whenever they make decisions that are so constraining and constricting to a certain persons or people's groups within the American society. One of the arguments that I think really needs to be highlighted here, and of course it's because I'm a woman, came from Amy Coney Barrett, who obviously a Trump appointee. She got in, on the list, very anti abortion, all good and fine. She's also an adoptive mother, right? She adopts or has at least one adopted child. She made the argument that is abortion really necessary? Posed the question, is abortion really necessary when we have adoption, right? And I think that is such a dangerous question and a dangerous thought. And I saw so many women on Twitter just completely just in a backlash against this thinking. The United States, particularly for women of color, has some of the highest death rates in birth, particularly African American women. You've had prominent people like Serena Williams, for example, detailing their birth stories and them being completely ignored by doctors to the point where their lives were at stake. Childbearing, it's not a safe thing in all cases, right? And so it is. I think the argument is spurious at best that adoption replaces abortion for those who are seeking that, particularly in cases where the woman has been raped, where the woman can't viably bring the pregnancy to fruition. What about ectopic pregnancies, right? Where the child is growing outside of the womb and it's not a viable pregnancy. What happens in those cases? It really does worry me. And as you pointed out, this is not going to just be about abortion. This is a slippery slope.
The interesting thing I look at here is that as you're having this push to undo Roe v. Wade, we've also seen abortion rates actually declining in the United States over time. And so if you just look at raw numbers, you might say there's more abortions, but if you look at as a percentage of the population, it's actually been reducing. And so I'm wondering if, and we see this sometimes where you have political or legal processes that are kind of behind what's already happening in society. I do think there is obviously this question of how should this issue be resolved, and you have many who argue it should be resolved through the democratic process, meaning we should allow elected officials to make laws relating to this. You have others who argue we don't put up individual rights for the regulation by majorities, right? And so where does this fall in that?
Yeah,
And that
agree.
That is such a contentious and such a difficult. I do agree with one thing that the Attorney General from Mississippi said, which is it's a hard issue, and it's hard because of all of this stuff that comes into it, right?
Absolutely.
Nobody, I would say this, probably nobody is 100% satisfied with the court's jurisprudence on this issue.
No.
Even with Roe v. Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood and the others. There's nobody who's 100% satisfied with that.
Sure.
Having said that, sometimes we have to recognize we're not going to get 100% of what we want in anything. And in a democratic,
it's not a democracy.
In a democratic, pluralistic system, sometimes a compromise that leaves a little bit of bad taste in our mouth is the best we can get to maintain, social cohesion, right? And to not have people who are just constantly at each other's throat. Right. And this has been one of those issues. I can't think of another issue in which you've had more people at odds within each other, expressing more hostility towards one another than this particular issue.
To the point of violence. I mean, you were around, I was coming of age, right? The 80s and 90s. I mean, we had bombings of clinics.
Some abortion clinics that were bombed.
Murders.
So
scary
it has
time.
And that's not to, and listen, that's not to say, again, which the court has never said, that there can't be regulation of this activity.
No.
And so finding that balance is always going to be difficult. Yeah. And I just think it would be nice if people could pull back a bit and think, okay, what can we live with, even if it is not exactly what we want?
Right.
And there doesn't seem to be any willingness to talk about this on the extremes of both sides.
Right.
And it's always the extremes that seem to drive the discussion, right? It's always the extremes that the media plays up the extremes because that's what gets people, attention and watch. And that gets us ginned up. I can't believe that they said that or this, and we want to go at it. So, I'm trying to be. I don't want to be the old voice of reason here, saying we need to take a breath, but somebody is going to be really unhappy with this court decision, no matter how it goes.
Yeah.
If we're surprised, and there's 5 votes to sustain any portions of Roe v. Wade or Casey, if we're surprised by that, there's still going to be a lot of people who are very unhappy, right? And so this issue, whatever the court does, and it'll be probably June or July before it issues an opinion.
So it's going to fester for
a while. Whatever it does is not going to solve the issue, because whichever side loses will be back, and they will be back as strong as they can be to undo this in whatever fashion they feel is needed to do that. And I just think that, and I don't know how to resolve that, to back people away from that, this constant fight over this, except to say at some point we've got to be comfortable with a situation that doesn't always make us comfortable.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, there's, it just, I'm going to reiterate that. There is, people don't engage in, women don't engage and make the decision to abort lightly. I don't, and unfortunately we saw some of the kind of younger female protesters out in front of the Supreme Court yesterday, kind of making a display of them taking abortion pills and being very, out there. And that's not the right PR, right? That pro-choice folks should be taking, right? This is a difficult decision that women are making, and that should not be taken lightly. And again, I don't know how far we want to allow the government to continue to regulate the bodies of women, to continue to regulate the activities that can be done by citizens, because again, as you said, it's a slippery slope. We fight mask mandates, for example, right? I mean, that is the most prominent example. We're living through a time where a Supreme Court that is predominantly men is telling women that our bodies are a battleground essentially, but at the same time you're having a group of folks who are not on my body, that's my civil liberties are being violated by wearing a cloth over your face, and so it feels so fraught. This environment that we live in feels so just fraught with contradiction.
I think it would be helpful if both sides in this discussion would acknowledge that the other side has some valid points.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's where we have to find
Common
some
ground.
medium.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that the folks on the extremes
Mm-hmm.
are the minority in
Yes.
this discussion. There are a lot of people
Yeah.
in the middle that are like, I don't like it, I wish we didn't have to have it, but I don't want a regime in which a woman whose life is in peril or something else, or who is in a circumstance that this would be devastating to, can't resolve it in a certain way. So at some point, people are going to have to be comfortable being uncomfortable if we're ever going to get past this contentious issue.
Which, unfortunately, I don't think.
And I don't think
is
that's
possible,
going to happen anytime
right?
soon.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
That's right.
I don't know.
It's-
I don't know what the future looks like.
It is. We are living in very interesting times. We can say that for
Interesting
sure.
is the word.
And I will tell you, I try not to. Now, listen, my family is older. My wife is not having to face these kinds of decisions at this point in time.
Yeah.
Perhaps my daughters might in the future. So it's easier. For some of us, it's easier to be a little more distant in how we see this, right?
Absolutely.
Than for people who are like, I'm going to be having a family soon. I want to have complete say in when and where and how.
Right.
And I don't want the state trying to look over my shoulder. And for those, I understand those arguments, and I'm sympathetic to any arguments that are rested upon personal autonomy.
Period. Yeah.
I do think that those on that side need to also look at this as, at some point, that is a distinct human being in the mother's womb, right? And we have to ask the question: at what point does it receive the protections that we expect a human being to receive?
Right.
And I don't think it's as simple as someone to say, well, before they're out of the womb, they don't get any protections, and as soon as they're out, they get them. That's a difference without much of a distinction there. And so there has to be some acknowledgement that there's a point, and it's a gray area, and it's not one that is easily identified. If we're all being honest, and we're all being saying we have to live in a society where we're not going to get everything we want, I may think it's a human being as soon as it's conceived.
Right.
But if I want to live in a society peacefully with others, I'm going to have to be comfortable recognizing that that's probably not what the law is going to say.
No.
If I'm going to be honest about it.
Yeah.
And it won't be entirely in this country. What this decision will do is it will bifurcate the United States on the issue of abortion.
Yep.
And probably will. And if we go down this road, you'll probably start seeing that on other issues as well, whether it's gun control, immigration issues, drug legalization, any of these kinds of issues. You'll start seeing this kind of dual country in which you have some states that do this and some states that do that. And the question I have is, A, is that a country we want to live in? And B, will we also start seeing states trying to prevent their citizens from taking advantage of what other states do or don't allow, or vice versa, right? And I think that becomes really problematic.
What about federalism? I always go back to when the states want to take back more power. Are we going to start negating the federal government?
We could. I think here's the problem: is I'm fine with federalism on a host of issues, except when it comes to should a state government have the ability to interfere with a constitutionally protected right, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So should the states be able to have different rules about gun control? Yes. Should they be able to have different rules within a broad setting about abortion? Yes. Should they have different rules about a whole bunch of things? Sure. But there has to be a line in which the Constitution says everyone who's, the 14th Amendment comes back
Right.
into play, right?
Yes.
It says if you're a citizen of the United States, you are entitled to all of the freedoms, all of the rights, regardless of where you live.
Right.
And so at some point we've got to be able to say, okay, this means there's a line here that states can't cross. But prior to that line, there's a lot of room for states to operate.
Interesting.
I think we would have a more peaceful country. But right now, it's as though everybody wants to forget about that and they want to nationalize every single thing. If I don't like what New York's doing about gun control, I want Congress to stop that.
Yeah.
If people in New York doesn't like what Oklahoma's doing about abortion, they want Congress to stop that,
Sure.
right? And so we want Congress to try to make rules, and that just disregards a whole bunch of stuff that I think undergirds kind of American democracy a little bit. So the 14th Amendment complicates federalism considerably by giving that guarantee.
Agree.
I think it was necessary.
Totally. Of course it was.
I don't know how you can get away from that, but it does make these issues more complicated, and finding the right line is not easy.
Yeah.
And I feel like abortion may be the hardest one because you have issues of political philosophy, you have issues of religion, you have issues of state power, all of these kinds of things that are coming into play here to say where is that line, where is that appropriate line, and right now there isn't really one that we've identified.
No.
Other than I would go back to say what the court was trying to create one in Roe v. Wade and Casey.
They were.
Knowing that it wasn't going to make everybody happy, but perhaps it could find a middle ground that we could live peaceably with one another as a result.
For 40 years or so.
And there's been all these efforts to go back and forth on
Tons,
it. This is the biggest shot those who want to undo Roe v. Wade have had in a long time. They've never had a court. They thought they did in Casey. They thought that was going to happen, and it did not. So this is their best opportunity. I'm going to encourage people, let's see what the court says. And I'm going to encourage you guys, don't rely on what we tell you what the court says. Don't rely on what ABC or CNN or Fox News tell you what the court says.
Read the opinion.
Read the transcripts, read the opinion, educate yourself so you'll understand what it is saying and what it doesn't say. And so when people come up and tell you things that are completely wrong, you will know they're completely wrong.
Agree.
All right.
We'll
wrap up there. You guys, we are hoping you're having a wonderful into the semester, right?
Even though it's 80 degrees outside.
It's
Happy
getting
holidays.
close.
It's terrible.
It'll get colder soon, I think.
I hope.
So,
My sinuses are killing me, my friends.
You can't have winter without a little bit of snow, right?
I mean, you can in Oklahoma.
Well, we've had a couple like that, but
Maybe.
I would like a little snow.
Me too.
All right, we will see you next time. If you'd like to reach out to us and let us know what you think or give us an idea for a topic, you can contact us at
notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu.
We will see you next time.